We'll start with a little brief kirtan, and the schedule is that we'll go until about quarter. It's 7:05, so we'll go until about 7:45, and then we'll have some questions and discussion. And if anybody has any questions along the way, why don't you use the chat feature, and then we can try to. I'll see. Let me bring up the chat. I'll try to glance at it now and then and see if we can answer any burning questions that you can't save until the end. So in other words, feel free to enter something on the chat, and then we'll see how we can work that in. So starting with the Kirtan. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamin Iti Namine Namaste Saraswate Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavani Ashyatya Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Krishna, Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Nitai Gaur Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Nitai Gaur Hari Bol Jai Jai Prabhupada Jai Jai Prabhupada Om Jnana Timrandhasya Jnananjana Shlakaya Chakshurun Mityangena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadamahyam Dadati Sabadantikam. I'm going to start by sharing the screen here. I can find the button here. So I think this should work. I'm going to talk just about these four basic things. Now this, overexploitation, deep ecology, and cultural ecology. Number 3, Vaishnava culture. And number 4, soul-centric and enjoyment that elevates. These are just sort of like maybe a little unintelligible the way they're presented here, but just to give an idea how things are going to be, how I'm going to discuss things. So even before I discuss overexploitation, the title of the talk is Enjoyment and the Environment. So this is hidden underneath this topic is that I'm going to describe how Vaishnava culture has practical solutions to environmental disaster. So this is a little different from Krishna consciousness. In other words, if I were to say that Krishna consciousness has solutions, then I would perhaps lead with saying that we just have to chant Hare Krishna, we have to adopt spiritual life, or something like this. So I'm not talking about Krishna consciousness per se, although you'll see later in the talk how Krishna consciousness is involved. Krishna consciousness becomes involved in a cultural sense because Vishnu and Krishna are at the center of Vaishnava culture. So let's start from the beginning, which is overexploitation. Now, there's a lot of concern with different environmental issues, especially highly politicized is the climate change. But in everything that I write and in speaking, I prefer to avoid climate change because it's so, it's just, there's political polarization and that kind of thing. So I prefer to focus on overexploitation. Overexploitation meaning, in my way of thinking, overexploitation is a polite way of saying greed. That we humans, it's part of human nature to be greedy. It's a part of human nature to be attached to sense gratification, or kama, and greed, you could say lobha in Sanskrit. But it expresses itself in overexploitation. In the Ishopanishad mantra, there is a mantra that says, Ishavasyam idang sarvang yat kincha jagatyang jagat tena tiktena bunjitha magrada kasya svidhanang. So the meaning of that verse is that one should accept one's allotment. One should accept one's personal quota. It's kind of like carbon footprint. There's a lot of discussion about our carbon footprint. So you could say that there's some remote similarity, just to get an idea what this one's quota might be. Because in the mantra, it says everything is owned and controlled by the Supreme Lord. Anyway, back to overexploitation. Overexploitation, meaning that we humans are using too many resources. We're overexploiting the earth. So it would be impossible to say that we should stop exploiting altogether, or we should stop using resources altogether. That's not practical. And even in the Upanishad mantra, it says that we should accept our quota. We should use just what is proper for us to use. But unfortunately, and as the modern culture has evolved in the last maybe 200, 250 years, or even more recently in the last 100 years, there's been a almost exponential growth in the exploitation of resources. And there's been a lot of attempts to cut back, but this is a big problem. Overexploitation, using too many of the Earth's resources. And those are either renewable resources. We use too many of the renewable resources, and we use too much of the resources that are not renewable. So this exploitation is a big problem. And I would say, that many would say, not just me, but I would say that this is the crux of the problem, that we are simply living beyond our means. And the way I like to describe it is, excuse me, I need to find a timepiece. I haven't. Oh, here it is. I don't want to go over time. So the way I like to describe overexploitation is that if I were a family person and I made $50,000 a year, but somehow I spent $100,000 a year, this wouldn't be fair to. It's going to debt, and the way humans are doing it is that actually by using excessive resources, we're basically stealing from posterity. We're taking the food out of our children's and grandchildren's mouths. So, of course, that's a very sort of humanistic way of looking at it. But and even more important is that we're disturbing the environment in which we live. We're making offenses against nature and ultimately against the Supreme. So let's move to deep ecology and cultural ecology. The reason I introduce these next is that these are two, I guess you could say, schools of thought or disciplines. Deep ecology is more a school of thought, I would say, and cultural ecology is a discipline, an academic discipline. So just in brief, deep ecology is a school of thought started around the late 50s and 60s, that basically says we're not going to solve the ecological imbalance by political means, by technology. There's a lot of discussion now with Greta Thunberg and with liberals who are pushing their environmental agendas. We have to restrict carbon or fossil fuels. And according to deep ecology, this doesn't work. There has to be some kind of a shift, like a cultural shift. Now, there's within deep ecology, there's discussion of change of consciousness. There's many ideas. It's a very broad idea, this deep ecology. But the fundamental issue is, and by the way, the founder of deep ecology in the 60s, Arne Naess, based some of his ideas on Gandhi. So the idea of deep ecology is to live more in harmony with nature. And generally, deep ecologists speak about things like ecocentric rather than human-centric. We're so accustomed to seeing everything in relation to humanity, but they talk about ecocentric, and sometimes there's a concept of biocentric. But I introduced this concept of soul-centric. At number 4, you see soul-centric or life-centric. So life-centric is perhaps more ecumenical. People understand that better. So deep ecology calls for a significant change, like a cultural change. So that's where I introduce Vaishnava culture. And this is perfectly natural within the realm of deep ecology because deep ecologists have a deep appreciation for indigenous cultures, for let's say pre-Western or pre-colonial cultures. And there's a little bias against Christian culture, not Christianity, but against the issues that have arisen, let's say, under the jurisdiction, I guess you could say, of Western Protestant Christian culture. So then the second item is cultural ecology. So cultural ecology is just what you might think it is. Cultural ecology is looking at different cultures and seeing their impact on the environment. So, for example, what's the impact that Vaishnava culture has on the environment? What's the impact that American culture has, or more broadly, Western culture? Or I would say that my personal view is that American culture is sort of united with European and Australian culture. American culture, believe it or not, some people don't even realize, but American culture or American society is the number one destroyer of the environment. The exploitation or over-exploitation of Americans and the concomitant waste is number one. This is how we've definitely become number one in the world. But it's not that it's contagious. American culture translates to global culture. So everyone is racing to catch up to that exploitation and waste. So moving on to Vaishnava culture. Vaishnava culture, now, well, let me say first that Vaishnava culture is an ancient tradition. It's certainly based on ancient precepts. But when I say Vaishnava culture, I'm talking about just like Christian culture. If we say that the West tends to be Christian culture, and the United States was founded and developed mostly by Christians or people who were within the Christian culture. It's not that everyone practices Christianity or everyone is self-identifies as a Christian, but the ideals, the influences, even the behaviors, the attitudes, the behaviors, these are all based on this sort of 1700-year, generally scholars say not 2000, but something like 1700-year history of Christian culture and Christian influence. Even those in modern society here and in Europe who identify as socialists or social democrats or atheists, these people, because they're part of the culture, they tend to inherit the mores or the norms, the attitudes, the behaviors of the Christian culture. So similarly, Vaishnava culture. Vaishnava culture, I'm not saying that everyone is a pure Vaishnava. So it's very difficult to say how many people are in this Vaishnava culture. Now, I like to use the figure 300 million. There's estimates that range from 200 million to 700 million. So I say 300 million. I like that number because it compares roughly with American culture, which is about 330. So if you look at Vaishnava culture, you see that still it's very much an agrarian culture, even though it's in modern society, modern Vaishnava society, the agrarian aspect is diminishing. It's still, however, an agrarian culture and agrarian society. And the Vaishnava culture, taken as a whole, is far more friendly to the environment than the American culture. They just haven't caught up with Amazon. And in this country, it's said that, at least according to my understanding, that now we have the influence of the virus, of COVID, that people are turning to purchasing things. They're continuing, they're excelling at their purchasing. Amazon is definitely profiting from this. So that means, in other words, what I'm saying is that this tendency for exploitation is very strong in American society. When I say exploitation, it's not necessarily when one uses things in moderation. Okay, so that's a kind of exploitation of the Earth's resources. So exploitation is not necessarily bad, but I'm using the word over-exploitation, meaning it's out of control. So sometimes people say, well, we have clean air in the US. I've been to India. I've seen that there's pollution there. Rivers are polluted. Our rivers are not so polluted. We have clean air. But what's happened in the US, I'll just cover this very briefly. I mean, there's lots of statistics about this, but in general, people say, experts, environmentalists explain that Americans use about 20% of the Earth's resources, but Americans are only 5% of the population. In other words, that's greed. If you're past a plate of samosas, if you're past a plate of sweets or savories, and you take 20 of them, then and you don't leave enough for the rest. So that's being too greedy. So Americans are greedy. So why is it that our air and rivers are relatively clean? Well, since the 1950s, our economy has transitioned from a manufacturing economy to more of a service economy. 70%, it's considered 70% services, and manufacturing has gone way down. So what's happened is that most of the manufacturing for our goods is done in China and other Asian countries, Mexico, even Africa. So our manufacturing waste, the filth that's caused by manufacture, the byproducts that are caused by manufacturing are are contaminating other countries. So in a sense, we export in this country, we export our contamination, our pollution. And it's not just the US, but US is number one, but Europe and Australia, they're also number two. They're close behind. And the other countries, it's ironic because other countries are called developing countries. I find it extremely ironic because these countries, they haven't come up to the economic standard yet of the developed, so-called developed countries, which actually means that they haven't come up to the level of environmental destruction. So it's really an irony. Number three, Vaishnava culture. Vaishnava culture, well, I was already talking about Vaishnava culture, but I wanted to establish that Vaishnava culture, with all its foibles, I mean, we know that there are some issues. If anybody's gone to India, it's not that this is a perfect culture, but in comparison, in terms of the environment, there is no comparison. There's no question. If you look at the statistics, if you look at the two cultures. Now, if you take a step back in time, 50 years, let's say before 1992, in 1992 in India, there were some economic reforms that introduced more globalization and along with that introduced more pollution, environmental destruction. So that was one period. And then if you go even further back, then you'll see that it was very much an agrarian-based society, much more so than today. And this sort of Gandhian concept in the early 20th century was very strong. Gandhi was very concerned about industrialization and westernization. And then, of course, in the 50s and 60s, his ideas were left behind. And again, I'm not trying to elevate Gandhi or I'm just saying that was the early 20th century. There was a lot of concern in India and in the among Vaishnavas that they should, or I like to identify as a Vaishnava, that we should avoid this, the contaminating influence of Western culture. Then going even further back, before the British influence they say that, for example, one of the influences of the British is the rail system. So some people think that, or many people think that the rail system, train system in India is wonderful. And it is. It's an incredible feat. And it connects people. So in terms of modern culture, the rail system is wonderful. But in order to make the rail system, forests were cut down, and tremendous amount of we already cut down forests for our pastures or our farms. But then to go even further, again, this is overexploitation. We say, okay, we have the right to cut down forests. We can make our farms. That we've been doing for thousands of years, tens of thousands. But then we go even further. We say, okay, now we also have the right to cut down forests and put down in this country, we have this whole road system, interstate system, which is precipitated by automobiles and so forth. So, and this talk is not about doing away with industry or technology or necessarily going back to an agrarian life. But let's go to number 4, soul-centric and enjoyment that elevates. So now I'm going to show 2 videos. This comes from my website. Here's one video. So Winston, if this doesn't work, can you let me know?
Human-centric versus life-centric. Are humans really the most important beings in the universe? The idea that they are the most important is a belief system that has plagued the West for hundreds of years. The alternate view is to revere the life in all beings.
Nature is animated by lush, fertile, active, colorful, and sensual life.
And it has rights. At minimum, that life or soul has the right to exist within its form or body. The culture that has a belief system that holds humans above nature is doomed. Its tendency to destroy and overexploit is self-destructive. Reverence for the life or soul in nature is an essential part of an advanced society, and Vaishnava culture has such reverence at its core. The conclusion: join the Save Earth Now movement, become an activist, and save our planet.
So these are just 1-minute videos. This is a 1-minute video, and there's another 1-minute video. You can see obviously that it's a very sort of subtle presentation. I use the word life-centric, and then at the end of the video, I say life or soul, so that this is meant for a broader consumption than just devotees. Devotees naturally understand the concept of soul. So all of these concepts that I present are based on Bhagavad Gita, fundamentally Bhagavad Gita, because as my view is that Vaishnava culture, just as the Christian culture is based on the Bible in general, biblical concepts. I mean, especially when I grew up in the 1950s, people would make biblical references all the time. People would say, just like, well, Moses this, or Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, or, I mean, even people who haven't read the Bible, they know these biblical references. So the Vaishnava society or Vaishnava culture is based on Bhagavad Gita, and people may not know all the ins and outs, but in general, the Gita forms the sort of the thinking of people. So what is the fundamental, one of the fundamental principles of the Gita is soul, that I am soul, aham Brahma. So this is a perspective in which Vaishnavas view the world. And similarly, this concept, I mean, sort of by the opposite token, this doesn't exist within the Christian world. View the world as that I am soul and that all beings are soul. So that's an important concept. And some of the influencers of deep ecology that I mentioned before are, they talk about this concept that we're too focused on humanity, human-centric. They call this human-centric or anthropocentrism. And this idea of anthropocentrism is, for some ecologists, for some environmentalists, this is the enemy, anthropocentrism. So this concept of soul-centric, which is very natural in the Vaishnava culture, I would say competitive. That's the word that comes to mind. It's a competitive philosophy. In other words, we have a competitive advantage if we present some of these things as Vaishnavas within the context of environmental movement. So I'm running short on time. Let me do the second 1-minute video here. It's called Enjoyment. And I don't know if you can read this. It says right at the top of on the right-hand image, elevated enjoyment, not exploitative. So we'll start this one. Enjoyment. At the root of ecological problems is misplaced enjoyment. Selfish enjoyment honors oneself and other humans at the expense of the environment. Unselfish, non-exploitative enjoyment celebrates all life. The Vaishnava culture has such enjoyment. It's based on the life force, the soul, the essence. Vaishnavas celebrate the gods of nature and God of gods Vishnu. Such celebrations are joyful reminders that life is not meant for selfish pursuits. Vaishnava culture has the practical solution to environmental disaster: enjoyment. Hundreds of millions of people have demonstrated it over thousands of years. It's a proven solution. And Vaishnava enjoyment can be adopted by American society. A change in the way Americans enjoy life must be adopted. Otherwise, society is doomed to consume and destroy all the resources the earth has to offer. Join the Save Earth Now movement. Make a change. Enjoy life without harming the environment. So that's, this is pretty much my presentation. I don't want to go over time, but the basic idea is that regarding Vaishnava culture is that in my presentation, I describe two basic things. There are a few others that I mention as well, but two important fundamental aspects of Vaishnava culture, Leela and Nama. So let me talk about Leela a little bit. Nama, of course, means the holy name, and we're exposed very much to the Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. And in Mahaprabhu's Shikshashtak, he uses the word Anandam Buddhi Vardhanam. So Ananda, Ambuddhi means the ocean of Ananda. Vardhanam means increases. So this holy name has the ability to increase our enjoyment. Now, the other aspect is Leela. If you look throughout Vaishnava society, I'm not talking just about Bengal Vaishnavism, Gaudiya Vaishnavism. If you look throughout Vaishnava society, throughout history, you'll see that there are Leela celebrations, even in home worship. When people worship in their homes, a lot of Gujarati Vaishnavas or Vallabh Vaishnavas, they worship Bal Krishna, baby Krishna. And there's a kind of Leela involved in that home worship. Or going to the temple, Natwara, for example, there's the temple visitor, the devotee, goes to the temple and has a kind of Leela with the deity. And the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, they also have their involved in these leelas with the Supreme, and everything is leela. All the Puranas, Bhagavad Purana, throughout the Puranas, leelas of Vishnu, leelas of Krishna. So this is the whole of Vaishnava culture, leela, based on leela, and enjoyment of leela. So, of course, we read in Bhagavad Gita, Rasavarjang rasopyasya, parang drishtva nivartate. So that means that we have to come to a higher level of enjoyment. So what I've tried to introduce in the pamphlets and books that I've written is that we have to come to the kind of enjoyment in the mode of goodness. I never really use this term, mode of goodness, but meaning we have to come to an enjoyment that's on a higher level, that elevates. And the highest enjoyment is transcendental enjoyment. And these tend to be, in Vaishnava culture, these are based on Leela. So what is enjoyment of Leela and enjoyment of Nama? We can see from the life of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu that that's Sankirtan. Also in these writings that I have produced, I don't use the term Sankirtan. But when we talk about enjoyment of Leela and Nama, or celebration, I do use this word, celebration of Leela and celebration of Nama, that is Sankirtan. So I'll stop here by saying that this is a pamphlet that I've written. This is on my webpage here. This is the webpage, saveearthnow.info. This pamphlet is, just quickly, it's called Enjoyment and the Environment. In the beginning, it talks about, I think you can see at the top here, there's this little blue subtitle, Enjoyment that Elevates. So different kinds of enjoyment. Then Vaishnava culture, enjoyment within Vaishnava culture. And then in the second half of the booklet, I talk about Bhagavad Gita. So the culture is based on the Bhagavad Gita, the Gita and Vaishnava culture. And at the end, Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita. And at the back of the pamphlet, I have a little ad for Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita. So this pamphlet you can download for free. It's about a 15-minute read. And I think I've given the basic stop share. There we go. That's my basic presentation. I see that no one has asked any questions or made any comments on the group chat. But if anybody would like to contribute, the basic idea that I've been working on this for some years is that this is a practical way of showing how Vaishnava culture and Krishna consciousness has something extremely relevant for modern society, global society, and especially for American society. I'm hoping that these are tools that you can use to present Krishna consciousness to others. Of course, I'm sure that you speak to others from time to time about chanting Hare Krishna and the importance of the holy name, but this is a little different approach. But the conclusion is the same, that our basic idea as a culture is to celebrate the Leelas of Vishnu and Krishna and celebrate the names of Vishnu and Krishna. Hare Krishna. Look at that, 4 minutes overtime. So please, discussion. Let me hear your challenges. What are your doubts? Why don't you think this is practical? I have a friend of mine. My best friend, he lives in England. He's American. His wife's British. His name's Rupa Vilas, and he's an extremely good friend. From 1973, we've known each other, served with each other in different countries, and I send him everything I write, and I tell him, you better not tell me what's right with what I've written. I want you to tell me what's wrong with it. That's his task. Whenever he praises me, I say, you're not doing your duty. So please, tell me what you think is wrong with this.
Prabhu, I have a question. Like Vaishnava culture is very personal, but there's also the impersonal philosophy in India also. It seems, intuitively, it seems like there's something impersonal about the way we mistreat nature and the environment. Can you say anything about how impersonal philosophies might be detrimental in any way for the environment?
No, I know that our acharyas are very anti-impersonal, anti-Mayavad, but in this presentation, I've chosen to go after modern culture, which includes modern science and Christian culture. It's a little bold and it's a little maybe little controversial, but and I'm not alone in this. Even there's one Christian writer, one professor, historian, who he also says that it's the Christian culture that's basically destroyed the environment over the last 250 years. So Christian culture, because it has not seen the soul, the way he describes it is that when you see the soul in nature, it creates a barrier for man. It's a sacred barrier. So when you don't see that, just like when let's take it from the perspective of man to man. So when the conquistadors came to the Americas from Spain and Portugal, they saw that men, the indigenous people, without soul, so they could do anything they wanted. So with nature, for 1,700 years or 2,000 years, this dominant culture, the Christian culture, has seen nature as soulless. So those cultures that see soul in nature, whether it's impersonalism, whether it's personalism, so I think it's more, for me, for my strategy, the way I approach it, is that it's more important to say Vaishnava culture has 300 million people. Now, some of those 300 million people are mixed with Vaishnava and Shaiva. If they're, some of them, a lot of them probably are impersonalists, they have impersonal leanings, but still they're celebrating Vishnu, Krishna, and they're not destroying the environment. I say, okay, that's good. That's enough. And modern science also. Prabhupada was interested in sort of putting modern science in its place. Now, I see on YouTube that there are a lot of people who are proclaimed atheists, and they say that we're rational. They classify people as you have your belief system, and I depend on science, what I can see, and it's rational. And then the implication is that belief systems or belief in God or having a religion is a faith. It's irrational. There's that kind of thinking is has become more and more dominant in the last 50 years, 30 to 50 years. So I say that you have faith in science to solve this environmental problem. That's a faith. We practice a culture. We are involved in a Vaishnava culture, and we can look at the history, thousands of years of harmony, relative harmony with nature, and what has modern culture with this so-called rationality, science as a basis, what have they created? So you want to say that, talk about rationality, but it's irrational to destroy your environment. There's the flaw in this kind of rational, so-called rational thinking. And when people say that, well, technology is going to solve the problem, or science will solve the problem, this is not logical. It's not rational. It's faith-based. They have faith in something. It's faith that science and technology will solve the problem. There's no component within science that says we have to control the things that come out of science. So anyway, I make a number of arguments there, and for my purposes, for my strategy, I would prefer to, instead of calling them Mayavadis, we can call them Brahmavadis. That's a more respectful term, I guess. Anyway, so this is my approach anyway. So in other words, it's not the fault of the impersonalists. It's the fault of the modern Western culture. In comparison, the impersonalists are fine.
Thank you very much. What about the idea of dominion? In Christianity, they have the idea that man has dominion over nature, which, can you comment on that?
Yes, that's the way when I present the Christian culture, those are the two aspects of Christian culture that I present. This misinterpretation, if you will. I mean, some people just say it's directly an interpretation to exploit nature, but to be polite, misinterpretation of the idea of dominion over nature, and then the idea that there's no soul in nature or in the creatures of nature. There's soul in plants, there's soul in animals. We know because the demigods, there's soul in forests and rivers. How can we say that a river has no soul when Saraswati is the river, or Ganga is the river? There's one river in the world, in New Zealand, that they've given that river, because of the indigenous people, they gave the river, the government gave the river personhood rights. So the river has rights like a person. In India, I think in UP, they tried to, the state government tried to assign the Ganges person rights as a person, but that was overturned. So the advantage of within the legal system, the advantage of allowing a person, allowing a river or a mountain or a forest rights as a person is that you can't just do anything against that. You can't contaminate. Just like I can't dump my chemicals on you, I can't dump my chemicals in. So this is one way of approaching. I think it's a good idea to say that Ganga is a person. It's certainly in line with the Krishna consciousness philosophy. So the idea of soul, that we see soul. And I would say that my ideal would be to someday appear in court and say that, to argue that that animals and forests and rivers have no soul is a religious perspective. So that way you could get into, if it would be possible, get into the courts, into the legal system, and fight culture to culture. Why do you say that it has no soul? Isn't that religious? Why do you say, okay, so don't call it soul, call it life? Why do you say that life has no rights, that only human life has rights? What do you define? How do you define life? Why do you define life in a Christian way or in an atheistic way? So I think that these would be interesting fora, the courts and legislative bodies. So I'm hopeful that at some point devotees will see that this is a very interesting platform on which to preach Krishna consciousness.
So Raj Prabhu says, thank you so much for connecting the dots, Prabhu. Recently attended the Apple Product Day. It's good that the big corps are all marketing low carbon footprint and green earth products. During this session, you connected the dots. The Vaishnava culture is based on green and clean earth over thousands of years. You brought the topic of rivers, and I have a quick question. Why do people in the US and in the West, why do they not take holy dip in rivers as like in India, people dip in the Ganges, Yamuna, Godavari, Narmada, Krishan, etc.?
I'm sorry, why what?
Why don't people in the US and the West take holy dip in rivers as like as people in India do, in the Ganges, Yamuna, etc.?
Why don't they? What, this is your question or someone else?
This is Raj Prabhu's.
Oh, why don't they take bath in the river like they do in India? Well, rivers are not, in India, according to the connection that the rivers have with the Puranas, their rivers are connected with the devatas and with avatars and Vishnu, Krishna, Shiva. Here in the West, the rivers are not similarly connected with divine. Now, one thing is, Raj says that regarding the Apple product, big corporations are marketing low carbon footprint and green earth product. I mentioned earlier, I don't know if you had the chance to attend the lecture from the beginning, but the number two item is deep ecology, and I definitely subscribe to this basic concept of deep ecology. I don't mean to say I subscribe to it as opposed to Vaishnava culture, but I think that their ideas are very close to Vaishnava culture. And Mukunda Maharaj and Judakarma Prabhu, Michael Cremo, they put out a book in the 1990s called Divine Nature. They also mention deep ecology and say that our perspectives are very similar. Deep ecology says that these modern approaches to the environment, just like these corporate approaches, are shallow. That's the whole meaning of deep and shallow. So deep ecology meaning that it's not going to work unless we can go to get away from this human-centric perspective. So when we have an economy that's based on humans, when we have corporations that are based on human products. Now, this is not anti-capitalism, but in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Yo bhunkte stena evasaha. So the one who enjoys yo bhunkte without yajna, without sacrificing to either the devas or the supreme Vishnu, yajna by Vishnu. Vishnu is yajna, as we see in the 8th chapter of the Gita. So without sacrifice, yajna, yo bhukte stena evasa, he is a thief. So Apple is a thief. They now have some, what is it? They've surpassed some $1 trillion in market value. So 500 billion they should immediately use in a grand yajna for Vishnu. This is my position anyway. And I believe that follows Prabhupada. So without using this market economy for Vishnu, all of these things are stealing. Apple is stealing from the earth for their products. Exxon is stealing from the earth. So since they're stealing, who owns this? At minimum, the devatas own all of these products. So there's an unwillingness to acknowledge that everything is owned by higher powers. Devas or Bhagwan, Krishna, Vishnu. So without these, they're stealing. Once Prabhupada said, I was on a morning walk with Prabhupada in Dallas, and we were going on that lake. What's the name of that big lake that Prabhupada, all I can remember is San Francisco, Stoll Lake. Anyway, big lake in Dallas.
White Rock Lake.
White Rock, yes, that's right. So he was on White Rock Lake. So we're walking on the lake, and somebody said, on the other side lives this man, H.L. Hunt. At that time, he was a little famous he was one of the big oil men in the early 20th century. The big wealthy people were oil people. So H.L. Hunt, and he was an oil man. So somebody said to Prabhupada that this man is one of the wealthiest men in the world, and just mention it. His house is over there on the other side of the lake. So Prabhupada said, what will you tell him if you approach him? So devotees were saying, Prabhupada was talking about how we're creating good citizens. This was his theme while he was visiting Dallas. There was a school there, so he was saying how these are model citizens. We're creating model citizens. So one of the devotees said, oh, well, tell him we're creating model citizens. So Prabhupada said, no, you'll tell him he is a thief. So I always thought that was a very interesting story. So this was about 1975, 74, 75, probably 75. So a year later, I was in Mayapur with Prabhupada, and on a morning walk on the roof of I guess they call it the conch building, the Prabhupada would sometimes, if he didn't feel like walking out on the road, he would take a walk on the roof and walk in a circle around the rectangular roof. So Jayapataka Maharaj brought this man up to him and said, I want to introduce this man. He's a life member. He's an industrialist. And Prabhupada said, oh, good to meet you. And they exchanged greetings. The man said, Prabhupada asked, so what do you manufacture? The man said, I manufacture glass, Swamiji. So Prabhupada said, oh, very good. He says, what? And how do you manufacture? What's the process? He said, well, it's manufactured from silicon, from sand. And Prabhupada said, oh, and who owns the sand? And the man said, oh, Bhagwan owns the sand. So Prabhupada said, so you are stealing from Bhagwan? I thought I love to tell these two stories as a couplet, because they show Prabhupada was telling his disciples, you should tell this man he's a thief. And then Prabhupada showed us how it's done. He called him a thief. So you were stealing from Bhagavan? So the rest of the story, just briefly, he sort of stepped back a little bit. He was talking with Jayapataka Swami. So then he came back to Prabhupada. Now, one thing you have to know about Prabhupada is that Prabhupada always had a comeback. You can't argue with Prabhupada. he wouldn't allow it. So he came back. He said, well, Swamiji, he says, I'm giving a charity. So Prabhupada said, oh, so you were just a little thief. So very sweet. Prabhupada was sweet. It was sweet, a sweet rebuke, but Prabhupada was making the philosophy clear. So Apple is a thief. But the thing is that there's a world of difference between that man who was stealing sand to make glass and Apple, who is one of the biggest thieves in the world today. So Apple must immediately sacrifice $500 billion in a wonderful celebration of Vishnu Krishna. That's the way the environment can be improved. To focus on Leela, celebration of Leela. Just like Rath Yatra. Prabhupada said we can have unlimited celebrations in unlimited cities, meaning that there are so many Leelas that can be celebrated. We can easily spend $1 million on Rath Yatra in 1,000 cities. So what's that? There's $1 billion right there. We'll manage to spend the other 500 billion too.
Jenya asks, Christian culture versus Chinese culture, what do you think the size of the destruction of the earth is?
I'm sorry again, which is what?
Can you compare Christian culture versus Chinese culture in terms of the size of the destruction to the earth?
Well, I think that the Chinese culture is catching up. All the cultures are catching up with the American culture. The unfortunate situation is that the American culture is at the heart of the. I like to joke with my Iranian friends that I was in Iran for 3 years. So there's a saying they say, Shaitani Bozorg, meaning the great Satan. So in terms of the environment, America is the great Satan. They're the ones who are destroying the earth. And unfortunately, that's a very attractive proposition. If I can somehow or other live a greedy life and it appears to be a good thing, I mean, since for the last 50 or 70 years, we've been talking about first world country, second world, third world, or now it's more politically correct to say developed country, developing, and sometimes underdeveloped. So these concepts are just horrible concepts. You know, a developed country is the most savage and primitive in its relationship with the environment. Who is destroying the environment? It's the developed countries. So all these other countries that are racing to catch up, they're in the same boat. I mean, they're getting there fast. So yes, China is destroying their environment like anything. But a lot of the destruction of their environment is on behalf of Americans, American consumption. So when I order something from Amazon, it's made in China. And that production of that product, whatever it is, it amounts to destruction of the Chinese environment, or maybe they import some of the goods from Africa. So for American enjoyment, consumer enjoyment, there's destruction of Chinese atmosphere, Chinese rivers, African forests, or however it goes. This is the way. Destruction. And the result, the strong argument that Vaishnavas have is that it's a misplaced enjoyment. How do we overcome greed? If we study the Bhagavad Gita, study Prabhupada's writings, it's enjoyment. Transcendental enjoyment, or even the enjoyment in the mode of goodness, is not destructive. Passion and ignorance, that's destructive. So enjoyment and what's transcendental enjoyment? Celebration of Leela. In Vaishnava culture, there's art, architecture, worship, it's home worship, temple worship, there's drama, goes on and on, based on celebration of Leela and celebration of Nama. So people can say, well, that's religious. I don't agree. I didn't join a religion. When I joined Prabhupada, I joined a culture. I was attracted because this is a culture. I was attracted because, for me, I was attracted to three things. Well, aside from prasadam, that was number one. But Prabhupada and the culture and the association of devotees. So the culture, I think, is extremely significant. And unfortunately, to say this is a religion, unfortunately, because people in this country and Western countries, they look down on religion. So I just don't like to use that word anymore. It's kind of like an accepted racism. If you say you're that religion, okay. It's like a subtle prejudice people have. So this is a culture, and it's a healthy culture. A healthy culture in relation to the environment. American culture is unhealthy. And if you have a better form of enjoyment other than ordering things from Amazon, then fine, okay. But our form of enjoyment is celebration of Leela and Nama. If you call it religion, okay, so fine. Then you develop your own thing then. If you think you've got something better, you develop it. But this has been developed for thousands of years. It's proven successful. And American culture is basically an experiment that's proving itself unsuccessful. How can you say American culture is a successful culture when the environment is crumbling? And they think that they can solve it through some political means or economic means. The Apple will change its products to clean products. The corporations will change to green products because they're driven by the greed of the people. And the greed of the people says, we hear that we're destroying the environment, so now please develop something that we can greedily consume that will make us feel better. Greed. You cannot address these problems unless you address the problem of human greed. And what does Bhagavad Gita do? It says, Krishna says, mode of goodness, you have to rise to sattva, and there is something called happiness in sattva. And we also know about transcendental, shuddha sattva. And what do we do for enjoyment? We enjoy Vishnu Krishna Lila and Nama. That's Sankirtana. This is our philosophy. It's a philosophy of Vaishnava culture. It's not just Bengal Vaishnavism. It's not just Gaudiya Vaishnavism. If you go to South India, you see they're having celebrations of all kinds of celebrations, Vishnu. Of course, now it's declined somewhat everywhere. But if you go to Southeast Asia, where Vaishnava culture was spread, Vaishnava and Shaiva culture was spread in Southeast Asia before Islam. You see that still there are many hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million people still practice the old culture, pre-Islamic culture, and they are celebrating Ramayana and Mahabharata, puppet shows, all these. So how are they enjoying life? How did people enjoy life before television? How do you enjoy life? You enjoy life by some simple way. You have to replace greed with enjoyment. One time, I think it was Bhakti Charu Swami, he was talking with Prabhupada. And I forget exactly what the question, how Bhakti Charu Maharaj posed the issue. But they were talking about attraction to sense gratification. And Prabhupada said, well, Vishwamitra was also attracted to sense gratification. So Vishwamitra was meditating for 100,000 years. So he also was attracted. So the solution, Prabhupada says, is enjoyment. That in Krishna consciousness, we have to enjoy. That's the way to escape the clutches of the lower enjoyment, the sense gratification, or the greed, the overconsumption of the planet. So philosophically, we have the answer for combating greed. That's philosophically. And if nobody wants to hear philosophy, how far can we get if we talk philosophy? People, they don't understand philosophy. This is practical. This is a culture. This is something that you can point at and say, this is the way a culture works. And I point at American culture and I say, this is the way your culture works. Your culture destroys the environment. And then I point at Vaishnava culture and I say, this is the way a culture sustains the environment. So that's not philosophy, that's practical. That's something observable. So I'm going on and on here. This is way over time, huh?
Yeah. That's all good. We've actually got some final comments as well in the chat.
Yes.
Devalina Mataji says, with great power comes great responsibility. All of us responsible citizens, rich or poor, should concentrate more on how we can give back to the environment and the planet and consume only what is absolutely necessary for our existence.
Yes, that's a good idea. I mean, that's a high ideal. Devotees often quote this verse, Isha avasyam idang sarvam which means that you should just accept your quota. But who knows what the quota is? So Prabhupada has established this principle of yajna. I mean, in his day, he tried to say that devotees should give 50% of their income to the celebration of Krishna's leelas and namas and Sankirtan movement. But of course, it hasn't proven successful. Among the many things that we haven't been able to do, this is also one of the things. But the basic principle is there, yajna, that if we make something, this is the 3rd and 4th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, that if we get something from, it comes from the higher powers. It comes from devatas and from Vishnu Krishna. So if we get something, we have to give back, and yajna. So yajna means to sacrifice, and our way of doing yajna is Sankirtan yajna. Our way of doing yajna, and Sankirtan yajna is similar in all Vaishnava culture, to make offering to Vishnu Krishna and to celebrate the leelas. And where was I going? Oh, and to distribute prasad. This is part of the yajna, that there's a distribution. Along with the yajna, there's a kind of distribution of wealth. So at least in terms of prasad, and sometimes other things as well. So yes, we should all do our part, but and I think that we need to push Vaishnava culture. It's difficult, I believe it's difficult to push Krishna consciousness in this sort of traditional religious way. We've sort of evolved in this way. Somehow we've evolved to this point where we want to push the Krishna consciousness movement as a religious culture or religion, Vaishnavism or Krishna consciousness. And I think that this is something I've been thinking about, meditating on, writing about for about 15 years. And I think that if we present Vaishnav culture, it has the 300 million people. We are representing 300 million people against the modern culture. So I'm a little bit, there's different schools, you could say, schools of thought within ISKCON, but I feel that the Vaishnava culture is a powerful presentation and based on the environment. So yes, Devlina Mataji says that we should each do our part. But in my view, our part is to push the Vaishnava culture, the Sankirtan culture.